Good afternoon, and welcome to the Forum on Racism and Justice. It's hard to imagine that it's been a year since Dr. Freed and I had the privilege of launching these sessions with the goal of providing a space to address issues related to racism in a manner that results in change. We were not sure how raising such challenging topics would be received. And there was, of course, the concern that these sessions would be a flash in the pan and go away once the height of the response to George Floyd's murder died down. But we have been deeply moved by the consistent support and encouragement we have received in response to these presentations. And as a result, we're happy to return after our summer break now for our second year. To start off this fall, we have a very special presentation that will be brought to us by our guest, who is literally part of the family. Michelle Freed is the immediate past Associate Director of National Young Leadership at the Anti-Defamation League, a leading anti-hate and civil rights organization in America. At the ADL, she worked to engage and empower young people across the country to address issues of bias, hate, and discrimination. Through her work, she managed ADL's cornerstone young professional leadership program, the Glass Leadership Institute, and advised ADL leadership on organizational strategy and in best practices in reaching diverse audiences across America. Prior to her time at the ADL, Michelle spent 2 years at the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation in Washington, D.C., supporting the Foundation's North American Jewish communal portfolio and leadership development work. Michelle is a graduate of the University of Michigan with a BA in Psychology and Judaic Studies and a minor in Community Action and Social Change. While here at Michigan, she served as chair of Michigan Hillel and a facilitator for the program on intergroup relations. Michelle now works as a senior facilitator and trainer at Resetting the Table, an organization dedicated to building dialogue, deliberation, and learning across charged political and ideological divides in American life. Now, doesn't that seem very timely? A few months ago, Dr. Freed shared a link for a video with me that was truly chilling in its implications for the times in which we live. We thought it would be good for us to share it in this venue. And in light of her work with the ADL, we thought that Michelle would be a great person to present on the topic. And she's entitled her presentation today, A Night at the Garden, White Supremacy in the United States, Then and Now. Now, Michelle wanted us to be sure to share that her comments today are her own and do not represent those of the ADL or Resetting the Table. So before we hand things over to Michelle, Dr. Freed will introduce the video. Thank you again for joining us. And don't forget to put your questions and comments in the Q&A, as we'll be saving time at the end to address them. Dr. Freed.
Thanks so much, Dr. Wilford. And thanks, Michelle, for being here with us today. Not long after the events of January the 6th, someone sent to me this video that we're going to show y'all in just a second called A Night at the Garden. And when I first saw it, I couldn't believe that it was actually real, because not that I was so naive to think that white supremacy and those types of activities only took place starting on January the 6th, 2021. But in fact, it was almost dystopian in the way in which this played out of an event that I was embarrassed, honestly, that I'd never even heard of it before. And so I looked online to see if it was real. And I talked to my daughter, who works in this space and has a real understanding of the history of white supremacism in America. And she very quickly assured me, yes, she was quite aware of it. And yes, it was really true. And I think Dr. Wilford's description of this is chilling and frightening with regard to what can actually happen in our country and what has happened in the past, and the importance of us staying vigilant and learning as much as we can. So I'm going to share this relatively short video. It's around 6 minutes long. and then I will turn the program over to Michelle. So I will just tee this up.
I pledge undivided allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Americans, American patriots, I'm sure I do not come before you tonight as a complete stranger. You all have heard of me through the Jewish-controlled press as a creature with horns, a cloven hoof, and a long tail. We, with American ideals, demand that our government shall be returned to the American people who founded it.
If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social just white Gentile-ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union, free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
So before we started the video, we heard that this film was chilling, jarring. And these images of the sounds of the past that we see is really hard to believe they even happened in the United States for some, right? So often when we think about the 1930s and the 40s and American identity, we think of us as fighting the Nazis, right? And yet there is not only this juxtaposition, to that sentiment within this film, but what's also jarring is that so much of the rhetoric we heard in that film seems to be echoing within our current day presence as well in the media, on our social media feeds, and what we're seeing oftentimes in our everyday life over the past 6 years or so. Before moving forward, I just also want to say, hi, I'm Michelle Freed, as Dr. Wilford and Dr. Freed mentioned, and I just am really honored to be with you today and appreciative to you for taking the time to learn and sit with this content as we explore it together today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I might do so a couple of times throughout this hour as we're together. And I want to move forward with just a little bit more context on the film to really lean into exactly what was taking place during that time. So like you saw, the rally was held right in the middle of New York City at Madison Square Garden in February of 1939. And this rally was not publicized as a Nazi rally. It was publicized as a pro-America rally, where over 20,000 people came out in the winter in the heart of February in New York, which is cold, maybe not as cold as it is in Michigan, but quite a trek, to be able to be present and show their patriotism under this rally. It was hosted by an organization called the German America Bund, which was an organization of patriotic Americans who mostly came from German ancestry in the United States. They operated about 20 youth training camps. As you can see, here is a picture of just one of those, and had memberships in the tens of thousands all over the country, across 70 regional divisions across the country. And in the film, you saw large patriotic banners, right, in display alongside what are Nazi symbols and swastikas, right? And so what may have seemed in this film as a form of foreign hate from German roots, somewhat imported in from the Nazi Party into the United States, I want to name actually carries a lot more overlap and nuance than we might think by this. And what I mean here is that the Nazi Party actually drew a lot of its laws, a lot of its norms that the United States had been upholding, and then were able to share with the Nazis as they developed their own laws for control and scapegoating, much of which coming from the ideologies of white supremacy upheld in the United States. Hate was not new within America, even at this point in 1939. We had the KKK in establishment since post-Civil War, out publicly walking in the streets of Washington. We had Henry Ford distributing The International Jew, a pamphlet spreading anti-Semitic tropes and conspiracies across the country. And in the form of white supremacy, around this time, Jim Crow was legally holding Black Americans under oppression as second-class citizens as well. And under this, in 1934, a conference of leading German lawyers actually gathered to exchange ideas about how they could best operationalize a racist regime. And the records from that meeting reflect that the most extreme among these lawyers were especially drawn to American legal codes that were based on white supremacy. particularly the Jim Crow laws of the period that operated to oppress and subordinate Black Americans in the United States. And so in the 1930s, lawyers of the Third Reich visited the United States in order to learn from American lawyers on the legal and economic systems that they were able to uphold. Some have stated that the Nuremberg laws themselves, which were established just a year later, directly reflect this American influence. So not only did the Jim Crow laws in the American South serve as a precedent in a legal sense for the Nazi Party and Hitler's regime, but the Nazi Party also expressed an admiration on how the laws played out in a political strategy, how the laws played out so that many people within the country felt as though they were just the norm, right? Everybody does it. There's justification for these policies as they exist, which also then took place as well as we saw under the Nazi Party, as Jews, as Black people, as members of the LGBTQ community were oppressed, murdered, and it being seemingly just the norm as well within it. And that was able to be taken from the political policies and strategies that were taking place in the United States under the auspice of white supremacy here. It's also worth noting that it was not only race laws that the Nazis pulled from the United States legal system in their efforts, but it was also an entire system of eugenics as well that pulled directly from the United States too. And so I want to just, pause to say, under this backdrop of knowing this, it might become a little bit less surprising than seeing this this film, that such a significant number of Americans would show up, would believe in promoting an ideology that would grant white people, Aryans, superiority over Black, Jewish, and other inferior groups within their own country. And as we see, these ideologies and systems of white supremacy were actually really deeply embedded into the United States laws, legal systems for quite some time, some of which are still carrying implications and effects today as well. Before moving forward, I think it's important, we've mentioned a few times, and even in the title, we mention white supremacy, right? And we've mentioned white supremacy and white nationalism a couple of times here. And I want to just pause to really focus on what it is that we're talking about when we mention white supremacy, white supremacists, the distinctions of the two, and how they intersect as well. So white supremacy, right, exists as a belief system that centers on the understanding and belief that the white race, this supposed white race, is better than others, should be in control of others as well. It's an obviously extremely anti-Black ideology that seeks to maintain the status quo as those in the white race holding power over others. So those who are white supremacists would follow various forms of belief systems which would uphold one or more of the following four key tenets. And those are: one, that whites should have dominance over people of other backgrounds, especially where they may coexist. That, an example of this looks like blatantly slavery in America as it exists, right? Holding dominance over people of other backgrounds, especially where there is coexistence. The second key tenet is that whites should live by themselves in a whites-only society. We see this play out in American history through segregation or through laws that prohibit people who are white to marry people of those who are not white or person of color. The third is that white people have their own culture, and that culture is superior to other cultures. And the fourth is that white people are genetically superior to other people, that it's not only a society, a culture, an idea, but biologically, genetically, white people are superior to other people as well. That white supremacy and those who ascribe to it, white supremacists. White nationalism is a term that originated among white supremacists as a euphemism for white supremacy. Eventually, though, many white supremacists tried to really distinguish it as its own, using it to refer to a specific form of white supremacy that emphasized defining a country or a region by white racial identity, seeking to promote the interests of whites exclusively at the expense of people of other backgrounds. And under this, in their eyes, Black people specifically were seen as subhuman, as dangerous, and as beasts, which obviously is, preposterous and dangerous in and of itself. And that is why we are here to name it and to talk about it, to identify and understand how it is existing in its current form today, and how it has been built throughout history. So the push to distinguish white nationalism came directly after the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That's really when we saw this push for many white supremacists to distinguish white nationalism as a new revolutionary social movement committed to building a whites-only nation that also held anti-Semitism as a theoretical core. Now, why was there this new awakening of white nationalism in the 1960s? Mostly what took place was that the success of the civil rights movement created a really big problem for white supremacist ideology, right? According to white supremacism, which was the law of the land, somehow a Black-led social movement was able to overcome a political regime that supported white supremacy. And from the perspective of white supremacists, they would likely be thinking, how is it possible, right? As a race of, in their eyes, inferiors to have unseated this power structure, this white supremacist power structure through organizing alone, right? And as we think about it, how is it possible that any group of people who are seen as inferior under the white nationalist and white supremacist ideology be able to overturn traditional norms, whether that be women and feminists looking to upend traditional gender norms or relations? How is it possible that, even if we bringing it to today, how is it possible to explain that there would be even the election of a Black president if it is the white people who are superior to all others, right? It actually just doesn't make any sense in the eyes of a white supremacist. So their answer for this is that it's likely some greater mythological power, right? A secret cabal that is manipulating the social order behind the scenes. The evil that this is must be controlling television, must be controlling banking, entertainment, education, even our own government in Washington, D.C., and it's brainwashing people. And that's the only way that this overturn of order is possible under white supremacy. And their answer is that it's the Jews who are doing this, that it's the Jews who are the arch nemesis, of the white race and has prevented the natural and inevitable imposition of white supremacy from being able to take order. And so just as we heard in the film, right, conspiracies of Jews controlling the press, controlling work environments and unions as well, so too, even within our American society, this idea of anti-Semitism as Jews being controlling is very prevalent. Here, Jews functioned for white nationalists as the demons that are disrupting the intended social order and are positioned as the absolute other, the driving force of white dispossession. Within this umbrella, not only does it clearly present a problem of anti-Semitism, right, as a core and central tenet of white nationalism, dangerous for those who are Jewish and those who are thought to be Jewish as well. But it also completely strips those who have been oppressed by white supremacist ideology from their very autonomy, real power and credibility that they have in actually successfully rising up against the forces of oppression. Because it said, really, these people are unable to actually overturn and overthrow white supremacy. It's the Jews, these mystical beings, that are allowing it to happen. What we know today is that white nationalists believe that whites, as I said before, are a biologically defined people. And what's more is that when their revolutionary spirit awakens, they will be called to take down the federal government, remove people of color, and build a state of their own. Maybe they'd call it the United States, maybe not. This might feel somewhat familiar with what we witnessed, as we mentioned at the beginning, this past January with the insurrection at the Capitol, which is chilling. And a question arises of, so how did we get here, right? How is it possible that our country has allowed these expressions, these ideologies of white supremacy and white nationalism to grow and to expand? And I'll say they were never completely gone, right? Never completely silent. We know that in the United States, organizations, individuals, movements have existed, over the course of centuries. But at various times, we see an ebb and flow as to the level of prominence and centrality that they hold within mainstream versus remaining on the fringe. There are patterns that we can look for as to when this more or less happens, right? The centering, the mainstreaming of extremism and hate ideology under white supremacy at its highest form, and when it's more so on the fringe. One thing that we see is that there is a resurgent, in replications of hate that sometimes seem to be a backlash to progress that is made against the ideologies of white supremacy, right? So some examples of that are in 1865, when the Civil War took place, Emancipation Proclamation, the KKK was established, right? We also saw this resurgence in the KKK again as well in the 1910s and the 1920s after a wave of mass immigration from Europe. Again, we saw it with the resurgence of the white nationalist movements in the 1950s and 60s in response to the civil rights movement. And again, what many of us in our current time are witnessing is a response in 2015 and beyond to many aspects of our country's progress, and one specific note as having a Black president, right? With the idea that we must take our country back so that white supremacy can prevail under this society. Now, I think it is important to note here, as we do look to 2016 and beyond, that I don't want to make a classification as we speak to Trumpism that anybody who supported or voted for Trump did so out of a deeply held extremist commitment to white nationalist ideology or white supremacist commitment. People are complex and nuanced, and there's many reasons that people vote in many different ways. And I think it's actually quite dangerous to our democracy if we only boil people down without room for our own complexities and nuances, if we make that level of jump for half of our country at this point. Though I will say, over the past 8 years, and certainly under Trump's presidency, is when we saw both a very not only strong backlash, but the space for white nationalists and white supremacists to grow and to take power. And give me just 1 second. my screen again. So over the last 6-8 years or so, and it increasing over time, extremists and specifically white nationalists have certainly felt emboldened to go from the fringes out into the open. They have been supported through dog whistles and sometimes bullhorns, have been spreading misinformation and conspiracies that are masked by patriotism, like we saw in the film as well, right? When these conspiracies and when these dog whistles and when these attempts to fight for our country are masked as these forms of patriotism, it also makes it a lot easier to recruit. As you in the film again, you saw the large banner of George Washington, right? And so it is hard then to tell people who care and love for their country that the symbols of patriotism that they are holding dear are actually antithetical to the ideas and ideals of democracy that this country is meant to uphold. So over the course of these last few years, white nationalists have really taken advantage of opportunities where they can, and do so in order to make efforts to really mobilize a mass base that is large enough to gain control over the state, right? They look to seize on current events to be able to grow their base and influence public conversation and attitudes through, spreadings of misinformation, of ideologies, and of conspiracies. They reframe the rejection of white supremacy as an attack on patriotism as well. And they claim that naturally occurring demographic changes is an intentional act to white genocide. They utilize these narratives in a way that then actually lead to the adoption of real policies that have real political impacts and personal impacts on individuals and communities, such as immigration enforcement, and in 2016, like we saw the ban on Muslim immigration, Muslim refugees, and even travelers as well. And so this is exactly, what we have seen play out when white nationalists and white supremacists are given the space and the opportunity to move as they wish. We see extremists feeling emboldened, resurgence of hate, leading to, the rally in Charlottesville, as well as additional real violence that has taken place in our country, whether that's shooting sprees in South Carolina, in Pittsburgh, in El Paso, and in Georgia. We see it as threats to our own elected officials, attacks on the American press, longstanding institutions, policies resulting in anti-Muslim and xenophobic immigration policies as well. And like in the 1930s, we also see a form of an internationalization of white supremacy as well, right? People outside of the United States taking on the ideas and the ideologies in looking to really spread white supremacy and white nationalism within their own states. Example being the attack on the mosque in New Zealand as well. Something that is unique, I would say, about this time, opposed to, within our history, is that we are also seeing a very strong new frontier of hate online, right? How cyberspace is being used to cause harm, spread hate, and especially recruit extremists. And this is why I would just say it is so imperative that social media platforms really adopt and adhere to policies that stop the spread of hate and the recruitment into extremist groups, so that this type of rhetoric does not live within our communal platforms, our communal spaces as well. Because we know, especially when forms of white supremacy, forms of hate take place, they never just affect one group or community, but really so many people are at risk, as is the very fabric of our democracy and our institutions that uphold it. It's important to note, though, I'll say that hate does not, in any form, rarely starts with the highest levels of extremism. And at the ADL, we look at a pyramid of hate to really illustrate how the prevalence of bias, hate, and oppression in our society works as a form of escalation into the highest level outcomes of hate, which is genocide. So on this pyramid of hate, we see that really hate starts in the form of biased attitudes that we might hold, right? Whether that's stereotyping, holding fear of differences that we carry, justifying biases by really seeking out like-minded people, right? And when these biased attitudes are left unchecked, they then can lead to acts of bias, people actually taking action on the biases that they're holding, which can look like non-inclusive language, microaggressions, cultural appropriation, name calling, etc. And when people then get into that flow, that act of acting on their biases, then that also leaves space to lead into systemic discrimination, looking like criminal justice disparities, housing segregation, etc., real implications on people's lives. And as it continues to go unchecked, we see bias-motivated violence, right? Vandalism, arson, murder as well, into then what we see as the highest form of hate implications, a genocide, the act of an intent to deliberately and systemically annihilate an entire people. And so it becomes really important that all of us see this and take responsibility to take action both within ourselves on addressing hate and bias wherever it might exist within us, but also in others as well, right? So that we really can interrupt what can become an escalation of hate that then can become out of our control within society as well. There are also other ways that we stand up to hate and confront it too, when it does actually reach its highest form. So one of the things that's extremely important that, again, I'll say was lacking immensely, specifically within the last presidential administration, was leaders and elected officials unequivocally condemning hate and putting it down. It is important that our leaders stand up and speak out against hate wherever it is there. I know for many organizations, nonprofits, and others, there is a sort of draining on making statements whenever anything happens. And yet, it is so important that we continue to speak out, continue to make statements, continue to condemn hate at all levels of leadership, so that when it takes place, people know that it is not okay, sending a message both to the perpetrator as well as the community and society as a whole. The next is that we as individuals and as communities can stand up to hate while it's taking place and spreading alternative messaging. So in the United States, we have something amazing under our First Amendment, which gives us the freedom to assemble and freedom of speech as well. Unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, this also means that things like hate speech are protected, right? So the rally was a completely legal thing. In Skokie, Illinois, there was a pro-Nazi rally that took place as well, that people were not able to say this shouldn't happen because we don't like the messaging, because in America, we have the freedom to assemble and the freedom of speech. But what we can do is stand up and spread alternative messaging, to stand up in larger numbers than those who are trying to spread hateful messaging are there. So that, again, we're continuing to show this is the type of community, this is the type of society that we are choosing to live in. Even at the Night of the Garden, there were tens of thousands of people who showed up and stood outside the rally for the entire time, protesting the messages that were inside as well. And so that is really important, to be able to show up and spread the messaging that you want to see. The third, I'd say, is investing in education and bias programs for kids in elementary and middle school and in high school, so that they can start to learn and understand and reflect on what biases they carry, understanding how factors of identity, power, and privilege play out on an interpersonal, intercommunal, and societal systemic level as well, and can be part of addressing problems at any point along the pyramid of hate as well, from bias up into that escalation. And the last I'll say, at the moment, is that when there is an act of hate that does take place, it's important that those who are perpetrators are held accountable. The ADL is looking to pass hate crimes laws in all 50 states that make sure that crimes that are committed with intent to harm someone on the basis of their identity are held to a higher level of accountability, because not only does it affect an individual and the people who are close to that individual when someone is attacked, but actually anybody who carries an identity of sharing with the person who is attacked on the basis of that identity is also caused a lot of harm from there as well in communities associated. So holding perpetrators accountable is also really important, so that we see people can't get away when they take action along these lines too. That, I believe, is the time that we have for me in speaking today, but we'll open it up to questions if anybody has as well with the time remaining. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you. That was so very informative. Just excellent. We're really grateful to you for being willing to address such a challenging topic in this forum for us, and for highlighting what happens when hate, extremism goes unchecked. We are most grateful. And so, as Michelle said, we are willing, we have time for questions. Okay, well, we'll take questions and comments, and we'll start with the first comment is from Dr. Martin. Great presentation. Thanks for the insights and comments. And so we have another question here. Let me see if I can read it. Oh yes, this is very interesting. So we hear a lot about the dark web, and I understand that you've done work in that area. Could you share a little bit about the dark web and white supremacy?
Absolutely. This is a very good question. So on our social media channels, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., people are free to share whatever they would like, if you will. But there are policies that limit what people are able to share if it goes against the policies that the organization or company sets out, right? If it targets another person or community, or goes against the communal guidelines that that organization wishes to uphold. What we saw over the course of last term's election, as well as the time leading up to the siege on the Capitol, is that more and more people were being kicked off of platforms like Twitter, of platforms like Facebook, forcing them then to go and find other apps, other websites where they would be able to interact with people in a social manner. Now, these websites, these other ones that exist, can consistently change and are really ripe with people who are waiting, extremists who are waiting for those to come to these websites and then recruit them. On these websites, there's also a lot of extremist ideology that is shared and spreads like wildfire to people then really being fully immersed in lots of conspiracies that are taking place. In my time at ADL, there were portions where I would assist or work with our Center on Extremism in tracking the various forms of conspiracies or things like that that were taking place on various platforms as well. Yes, it is dark. It is not PG rated at all, I would say, spreading conspiracies of, different anti-Semitic and, murder tropes, child pornography issues, and also vilification of, the press, American institutions, democracy, and continued conspiracy theories that things like the election, was rigged, ones as well that show that, like, when President Biden went to take his place on the Capitol, it was someone else and not really him, but people just will lean into and pay attention to these conspiracies as they form on these alternative platforms as well.
Wow. And it seems that they sort of spread from those alternative platforms out into the general public. And we have all of the conspiracies and misinformation that affects health, right? Because we even get to see that around issues about the pandemic, things that people should do to protect themselves. They won't because of all of these conspiracies. Yeah. So dangerous.
Absolutely. And on that point, I'd say I heard one time from Eric Ward, who is an incredible leader. Currently, he's the executive director of the Western State Center, once described extremism similarly to the fashion industry, if you will. And what he did by this was saying, oftentimes when we see fashion shows or things that, just the beginning of a fashion line, they might be things that people would see and say, that's very incredible, but I would never wear anything like that. But then we actually see, patterns or elements that come out in these kind of like larger, grander than life fashion shows in the actual fashion that we end up wearing in that season or the next season and the next year, in a way that I think in this case really shows how even when things are maybe on the fringes or people think are way out there, find their ways into the mainstream and then the central operatings of people in their everyday lives as well.
That is such an excellent example. Thank you. All right, we have a couple questions here. So one from Dr. Lewis. Great presentation. On the topic of counter demonstration / messaging, can you speak to the location and timing of a counter protest? Is it most effective at the same time or location, or for safety, is it better to occur at a different location or separate time?
So this is a great question. And I would say that this is likely really dependent on the specific counter protest you might be showing up for. So if you know that there is, let's say, a armed militia protest taking place, I personally would recommend that you not show up at that same time, but rather you actually allow whether it be elected officials or security teams or a police force to handle those militia movements and armed militia for your own safety. However, if there are other times where it makes more sense that, you can rally together a group of people that will drown out a small section of hate messaging that might take place in your local community, that can also be really effective. But it definitely matters, the specific example that you're speaking to. And I would also recommend, as you're doing so, work with local officials to see what is already happening maybe within your community, and also work with communal partners to really build up a large, broad base to create strategy together that can lead to an insurance of safety for all those who want to be a part of denouncing that hate or showing up with alternative messaging.
Excellent. And the follow-up question, can you also speak to managing emotional fatigue and distress that comes from dealing with these issues over the longer period of time? Yeah,
that's another great question. I'm not always perfect at it, I'll say. I think in terms of, for me, dealing with this work is that if I know that I'm working in an organization or in a community or in relationship with people, who care deeply about bringing goodness and upholding our systems of democracy to the places that we live, having what to do and being involved in is really helpful for me than just watching things take place on the news and feeling really helpless. So I would say, as the issues arise, for me, it actually really helps to reach towards community or to reach towards my place of work and thinking about, okay, what are we going to do about this? But to also make sure that those relationships include, fun things too. So it's not always just about it. And, if there are days, if there are moments where you say, I need to turn my phone off, I need to check out, we're not meant to hold the rush of information that is consistently in front of us. So I would also say, make sure you set boundaries and barriers for yourself of, when you want to turn on the TV, work on these issues so that you can, when you do decide to show up, really be your full self and 100% ready to get on there. Because if you're not able to do that, then you also won't be able to be as effective in addressing as they arise and come through.
Wonderful. So take a moment to recharge. Have your time when you recharge. Okay. And here's a question. I recently heard of adrenochrome for the first time. How do we find common ground with people who live through the lens of a conspiracy camera? If they reject mainstream media, it's really hard to find common values.
Yeah, so this is something that's really hard. And I'd say an element of the toxic polarization that is taking place in our country and our communities and the people we're in a relationship with today as well, that when we're not in communication with each other, when we're not getting news from the same sources or able to share information openly with each other without fear of backlash, we end up shutting down, which then pushes people into further zones of conspiracy and just complete, I'd say, shutdown from people with whom we might hold different beliefs or understandings to. In terms of how do we really find common ground with people who live through a lens of a conspiracy camera, I would say the first thing is to start by speaking with them, to really make your best effort to show them that you understand what it is that they're saying, what it is that they believe, and what it is or where it is that they're coming from. And I'll say, to say that you understand does not mean that you are saying you agree, right? But when we can say to someone, I'm really trying to understand what you're saying. Is this it? Am I getting this right? And they're able to say, yeah, that's what I'm trying to tell you. What it can do is it can really disarm elements of tension that exist in conflict, so that then you are able to really respond and say, okay, I really understand this. And now I'd like to offer, my own perspective on how I see things. But oftentimes when we come into conversation across lines of difference or across divides, we're so tense, we're so charged that we're unwilling to really take a second to listen, to understand what somebody else is saying before offering our own. And then we end up just talking past each other. So that's as hard as it can be. I would recommend first, just sitting down and really working an effort to get to that point of understanding, and you breaking that pattern to say, hold on, I just really want to understand where you're coming from. What is it that you believe, and once I can show and reflect that back to you, I'd love to, offer my own perspective within that as well.
Thank you. Great advice. So just before we end, are there any resources that you would recommend, particularly for young people? Because I feel like these groups really reach out to young people to try to recruit them. And that's sort of a playbook, I guess, across the world. They've done it, and in Nazi Germany, they did it. And I think it's done here too. Are there particular resources, books, websites that you would recommend?
Yeah, there is. So, shout out to ADL. They have so many amazing resources for kids K through 12, a lot of different anti-bias and identity-based resources for learning kids at various stages of life and development as well. So I would definitely check out ADL's education page, and they also run a program called Book of the Month, where each month they highlight a book that focuses on issues, identity, bias, etc. For kids at various ages and stages of development as well. So I think they do just a lot of really, really great work. And the other thing I would say is also, if you do have young kids, I know many of you work in pediatrics though, speaking with school administrators to make sure that anti-bias learning is a part of their school environment and curriculum as well. So I know there's lots of different organizations out there who do this and do it in partnership with different schools. Again, ADL has its No Place for Hate program that I would recommend. But there's lots of other ones out there as well.
Well, thank you again, Michelle. Really grateful. That was we learned so much, so informative, fantastic. We wish you the best in your new position and as you work to push back against hate and bias in our country. Thank you all so much for attending. We hope that this presentation has helped to provide some inspiration for action to bring about change. And we invite you to join us next month for our Forum on Racism and Justice, where Dr. Glenn Flores will be our next presenter. Until then, stay safe and try to take action. Bye-bye.